This is the kick in the balls tactics. It's too early for anybody to be asleep. And I didn't smell any alcohol as I walked up there, so I don't think anybody's drunk. And you bought a ticket to come here and see this, so nobody's stupid. But you're being conditioned. There is tactics going on here that have been going on for the past 5,500 years. And you know what? We actually have an opportunity. We actually have an opportunity to see through the veil, see what's going on, and do something about it, and not be lulled into all this crap. We have some choices to make. And this symposium, and like previous symposiums, it's incredible the way, there's no collusion between the speakers, but it's amazing the way that the talks seem to follow a particular pattern. And I don't think that this symposium is going to be any exception. In fact, I think it's going to be really quite remarkable. I think the links between what I'm going to introduce today, joining a few dots, and then some of the speakers are going to expand upon through the weekend, will force you, if you haven't already, to actually reflect and make those choices. And Andy told me he's going to put a bucket of sand outside the door, so that if anybody really does want to go and stick their head in it, that's absolutely fine. Because apparently Glastonbury needs a few more places for people to park their bikes. This information that I'm going to share with you, and as is always the case, don't take anything I say at face value. We live in a very unique age here. You have almost instant access to the physical manifestation of the Akashic records. It's called Google. Unfortunately, they also have access to everything that we look at, but that's their problem. But this has been going on for a long time, and let me give you a couple of quotes from a document that was actually made public, believe it or not, in 1967. It's from a meeting that was held in the early 60s, immediately after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's called the Report from Iron Mountain. And once again, you can go download it and you can take a look at it. And the full title is The Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. But it's a fascinating document. It's not that long, but it's fascinating in looking at the mindset of the people who were tasked with coming up with ways and means to keep the world at peace. And there's a couple of observations I'm going to share with you. One is, wars are not caused by international conflicts of interest. Proper logical sequence would make it more often accurate to say that war-making societies require and thus bring about such conflicts. It's been true for 5,500 years, and it's still true today. But this is one of my favorite bits. It says, war as a general social release. This is a psychosocial function serving the same purpose for a society as do the holiday, the celebration, and the orgy for the individual. So let me get this right. What they're suggesting is they can either lay on wars or orgies. Of course, either way you get fucked, but... And of course, we see that today in the press because, what price morality? So Max Mosley obviously decided to go the orgy route. We can follow on from some other documents, and I want to introduce you, and there's quite a very interesting cycle to events, which, some of you I'm sure will have picked up on. But let me introduce you to this, and I'm just going to introduce with a couple of clips here. The capacity to assert social and political control over the individual will vastly increase. This was written in the late 1960s. In fact, very shortly after that document became public. It will soon be possible to assert almost continuous control over every citizen and to maintain up-to-date files containing even the most personal details about health and personal behavior of every citizen, in addition to the more customary data. These files will be subject to instantaneous retrieval by the authorities. Power will gravitate into the hands of those who control information. Our existing institutions will be supplanted by pre-crisis management institutions, the task of which will be to identify in advance likely social crises and to develop programs to cope with them. This will encourage tendencies through the next several decades towards a tectonic era, a dictatorship, leaving even less room for political processes as we know them. Finally, looking ahead to the end of the century, the possibility of biochemical mind control and genetic tinkering with man, including beings which will function like men and reason like them as well, could give rise to some very difficult questions. No shit. Well, this was written by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book Between Two Ages, The Tectonic Era, which was published in 1969. And by the way, I'll also make the observation that in the report from Iron Mountain, it talks about introducing things like climate change to keep the masses amused, to keep the people focused. But it actually acknowledges, in 1963, it actually acknowledges that it will take a generation to a generation and a half before the public really bite on it. But guess what? That's where we're at. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a very significant player in the geopolitical arena. Along with, he's a David Rockefeller protege. He founded the Trilateral Committee. He identified Jimmy Carter. He invited him to join the Trilateral Committee. And, of course, ultimately, Jimmy Carter was financed by Rockefeller money and became president of the U.S. Zbigniew Brzezinski is the democratic equivalent of Henry Kissinger. It would look a bit suspicious if Henry Kissinger was sort of, in the background, regardless of who was in office. So Brzezinski is the democratic equivalent. But he wasn't really that popular with Clinton. So Clinton basically sent him back to academia. And in the 1990s, he wrote a number of books, but one of the most significant was The Grand Chessboard, where he acknowledges that the public supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, he made that observation because just 2 years previously, Clinton didn't quite go so far as to issue an apology to Admiral Husband Kimmel, who was the commanding officer of the Navy in Pearl Harbor at that time, but he went as far as he dare because the facts show that Pearl Harbor was a contrived event. Brzezinski acknowledges in his book, he says, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues, except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. Writing in 1997. And of course, pretty much that phrase was taken on board by the Project for New American Century, the extreme right-wing think tank, which published this document in September 2000 called Rebuilding America's Defenses, where they acknowledged, they said further, the process of transformation, i.e. America taking over the world, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor. Well, of course, it didn't take long for them to get that Pearl Harbor, did it? And last year, in my talk, just titled Fool Me Once, I introduced you to the remarkable similarity between the physical events of 9/11 and what actually occurred or is depicted in the Tower Tarot card. Particularly, look at the top of Tower 2. Just before it collapsed, it leant over just like the crown on the Tower Tarot card. What happened that day was the crown chakra of the planet was absolutely blown open. And it launched the most significant 10 years in the history of this planet and of humanity, probably since the days of Atlantis. Now, we've only known about 2012, ostensibly. It's only been in the public consciousness since 1987 with the publication of Jose Arguelles' book, The Mayan Factor. But as I demonstrated in the talks I gave here in both 2006 and 2007, those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom have known about this period for a much longer period of time. Also in the report, Rebuilding America's Defenses, is another mention of genetic modification. It says future soldiers may operate in encapsulated climate-controlled, powered fighting suits laced with sensors and boasting chameleon-like active camouflage. Skin patch pharmaceuticals helping to regulate fears, focus concentration, and enhance endurance and strength. I mean, is it any wonder that the American forces are committing atrocity after atrocity after atrocity? Because they're having the humanity pharmacologically removed from them. They are not operating within what we recognize as the bounds of humanity. And these guys, particularly the Rockefellers, have been fundamentally, openly trying to transmute humanity for at least the last century. The Eugenics Association of America predates the eugenics research in Germany by almost 20 years. Much of the early eugenics research in Germany was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And Operation Paperclip, which most people think was about bringing rocket scientists from Germany to the US after the war, was also about bringing their genetic scientists back to the US. And eugenics is alive and well and encroaching on every facet of our society. I've spent pretty much best part of the last year trying to raise awareness of a thing called Codex Alimentarius. Now, just to sum this up, this is the global intent by Big Pharma, both with an F and with a PH, to wipe out organic farming and to completely destroy the complementary and alternative healthcare industry. It's part of the Club of Rome. It's a committee that was established in 1960 and 1962. And some of the legislation that has come from the Codex recommendations is already in place. And the most pernicious aspects of this legislation will kick in December 31st, 2009. And Dr. Robert Verkerk will be here on Sunday. He's the chief executive of the Alliance for Natural Health. And hear it firsthand. Hear it from one of the guys who is fighting Codex. And this book here, Codex Alimentarius, Global Food Imperialism, is one of the few books. It's collated by a guy called Scott Tipps. He's the president of the National Health Federation in the United States. And it's a collation of essays from people who have had direct experience of the Codex agenda. It's an essential read. But, we have a lot to thank this guy for, because this is the guy who exposed the pernicious agenda for GM foods in this country and across Europe. This is Dr. Arpad Putzai. And Dr. Arpad Putzai was the chief scientist of the Rowett Institute in the late 90s. And he wrote an article which appeared in The Lancet, which basically questioned the whole integrity of the GM food industry. Now, 10 years previously, the GM food industry got a real fillip when George Bush Sr. basically said, genetic foods, they're fine. And he introduced a phrase called substantial equivalence, which means, looks like corn, smells like corn, must be corn, with absolutely no recognition of the fact that there have been significant genetic modifications in that corn. And what basically Dr. Arpad Putzai was saying was that, we have no experience of what this does to the human body. And we still don't know. The British government has effectively washed its hands of the GM agenda. Basically, it said, whatever Europe tells us to do, then we'll do. Because in case anybody doesn't realize yet, the UK no longer exists. The Treaty of Lisbon was ratified a few days ago. The UK no longer exists. And I came across a document a few weeks ago, which was written in 1971, which was aimed at British cabinet ministers. And it said that if Britain goes into the common market, the major role of the British government and every other national government is to conceal from the people the magnitude of power being handed over to Europe. GM is determined by Europe. And of course, we find that the British government have not only paid $34 million towards financing research into GM crops, we find that government ministers are effectively being lobbied, which means by the biotech industry. And by the way, a few people will remember that in 1973 there was a contrived oil crisis. And on the back of that, Henry Kissinger contrived a food crisis. And the purpose of that food crisis was to destroy the American family farmer, which is exactly what it did. Back then, in the early 70s, 85% of all farming in the US was family farming. Today, it's completely the reverse. So the food crisis in 1973 gave the agribusiness the opportunity to buy in across the whole of the farming area across the US. And this manipulated food crisis, on the back of this manipulated oil crisis, is about introducing GM foods. That's Big Pharma. Look at the work of William Engdahl and Jeffrey Smith. They have books by the same title, Seeds of Destruction. Perfect place to start your research on the subject. And the pharmaceutical industry. Prozac is now so prevalent it can be detected in the water supply. It's worse in certain places in the US than it is in the UK, but it is still fundamentally the most prescribed drug in this country. And guess what? This is the nursery for Prozac, Ritalin. Look at this phrase here. Thousands of hyperactive children are being... Here. Oh. There we go, thank you. Thousands of hyperactive children are being given Ritalin, which can stunt growth, or even schizophrenic drugs. It says, are they the victims of a real illness or a contrived illness dreamed up by the pharmaceutical industry so that they can market these products? This is an extremely valid question. It says, perhaps the most disturbing suggestion that ADHD, attention deficiency and hyperactivity, is nothing more than the invention of pharmaceutical companies. And last year, the NHS spent £28 million on Ritalin alone. 10% of all children in the US are on Ritalin. I was just a naughty boy. Now, the moment there's any hint of a problem, Ritalin. And we know that there are, what the pharmaceutical industry determines as side effects. These are not side effects, these are effects. And the pharmaceutical industry is the world's #1 killer. More people die from properly prescribed drugs than for any other reason in the Western world. More than automobile accidents, more than the wars even. The pharmaceutical industry, remarkable as it may seem, kills more people than the US military. Staggering, but true. And just in case we haven't got enough kids taking the Ritalin, what we do is we stimulate the hyperactivity by giving them drinks. These drinks are banned in some states in the US because they're targeted at under 12s. And if you buy the drink in France, it has a different caffeine content than it does in the UK. So this is a symbiotic relationship between the food companies and the drug companies. And the great tragedy is that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't really understand how Ritalin works because it's actually a stimulant. And yet, on the young brain, it has the opposite effect. There was a TV documentary on some months ago which looked at Ritalin and looked at how families were dealing with hyperactivity and dealing with the after effects or the effects of Ritalin. And there was one young child, and she was obviously a very boisterous young girl, and they showed her, larking about like a normal, healthy child, but apparently she did it sort of 24/7. And then she was given Ritalin, and the next shot was of her. And her mother was asked how her life had been changed by her daughter having Ritalin. And she said, well, obviously it's made my life a lot easier, but it's not my daughter. How true. It was not her daughter. These drugs don't just deal with a particular symptom. They are changing the genetics. This is the purpose of them. And this purpose was seen a long time ago. So once we've got the kids on Ritalin, then we can go to Prozac. The pharmaceutical industry sets itself goals. Right now, 40% of the US population are reliant in one way, shape, or form on the pharmaceutical industry. Or they believe that they are reliant on the pharmaceutical industry. Well, the pharmaceutical industry isn't going to stop there because it's got another 60% to go. There's going to be another talk during the weekend about vaccines. So I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on vaccines, but I do want to draw your attention to something that Rudolf Steiner said in 1917 in one of his lectures in the series titled The Fall of the Spirits of Darkness. He said, the spirits of darkness are going to inspire their human hosts in whom they will be dwelling to find a vaccine that will drive all inclination towards spirituality out of people's souls when they are still very young. Children will be vaccinated with a substance which it will certainly be possible to produce, and this will make them immune so that they do not develop foolish inclinations connected with spiritual life. And then he observes foolish here, of course, in the eyes of the materialists. An extremely prescient observation. What do we see recently? I was actually in the States when the cervical cancer jab was introduced in all schools across Texas. And by the way, in Texas, you cannot put your child in school unless they have the certificate to show they have been through the full vaccination program. And if you don't, and there are other states as well that do this, but I'm talking about Texas because I have first-hand experience. There are other states where if you don't vaccinate your children, the states will forcibly take your children and have them vaccinated. And now we see this same cervical cancer jab being introduced in British schools. But what do we find? The chief financial officer of GlaxoSmithKline, which happens to make this drug, is on the board of Ofsted. I mean, look, you can always find the connections. You do have to look, but there are always connections here. I mean, these guys have a very pernicious agenda. They're very good at what they do. We shouldn't take anything away from them. But Big Pharma, let's be very, very clear about Big Pharma's agenda. And Big Pharma's agenda is to maximize the revenue stream from the conception of a life form to death. Do you know what? Do you know there's farmers in this country who won't feed their livestock the shit that is served on the shelves of supermarkets here? Livestock is the farmer's livelihood. He needs to keep his cattle and his sheep healthy. So he doesn't want to be serving them with irradiated food. Vet's expenses are, quite significant. He needs to keep the vet away as much as possible. So, take a look at what farmers are doing, and then you take a look at what's happening, in the human world. It's becoming more and more difficult to get hold of organic foods. And by the way, is it really organic? Because part of the Codex Alimentarius directive is to gradually increase the amount of contamination in organic food. So at the moment, an organic food can have 0.9% contamination and still be classed as organic. That's going to change shortly to 1.6%. Where does it stop? And eventually, of course, it won't be worth the organic farmer's while to try and maintain an organic farm, so he'll just give up and grow the other stuff. And the surveillance. I mean, this is just completely outrageous. And of course, it's exactly what Zbigniew Brzezinski was describing 40-odd years ago. And what do we see? We see these cars now. I mean, this is a film clip from the Google car. You see the Google car here driving down the street. So whereas at the moment you can go to Google Earth and you can punch in your postcode, and you can zoom in on your house, which apparently is bad news right now if you've got a swimming pool in your garden, because, what the kids are doing is searching Google. They're searching for houses with swimming pools, punching the postcode in Facebook and saying, potty! But you can't block it. Well, the next step is to introduce Google Street, where you punch in the postcode and you can actually take a drive along that street. And you can see exactly what's going on down that street. I mean, it is just incredible. And this is very recent. I mean, it's EU legislation. It is coming here. It's already implemented in Sweden. But the US is demanding more and more access to information. I mean, see big news items at the moment. More and more people are booking holidays. Choosing was a great word. Choosing to book holidays in the UK. This is not a choice. Basically, we're being forced out. Travel is being deliberately restricted. And you've got to love this part of this article. It says, US gets access to our personal files. This will include all visitors' financial details, their bank statements, salaries, who they write checks to and receive money from, what they buy with credit cards, and what internet sites they visit on their home computer. I think that pretty much means that I won't be getting into the US anytime soon. Yeah, another contributor to US on the globalists' foreign policy is a guy called Alvin Toffler. And he's written about scientists in their laboratories trying to devise certain types of pathogens that would be ethnic specific, so that they could just eliminate certain ethnic groups and races. And others are designing some sort of engineering, some sort of insects that can destroy specific crops. Others are engaging in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. So there are plenty of ingenious minds out there that are at work finding ways in which they can wreak terror upon other nations. It's real, and that's the reason why we have to intensify our efforts. And that bold statement was made by the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, in April 1997. Well, of course, we know they've got the techniques for global climate control. This is HAARP, the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, this massive array in Alaska. There are those, who have researched Hurricane Katrina and identify some very, very strange things in the satellite photographs in the immediate hours before Katrina hit New Orleans. And then chemtrails. What is going on here? Anybody who denies that chemtrails are a phenomena needs to go use that bucket of sand that's outside. This is a series of photographs taken, it's actually from my house. And watch what happens. Over the course of a few hours, we watched the planes going backwards and forwards. It was a beautiful, beautiful morning, crisp, clear blue sky. And within a few hours, this sheen of trails covered the sky. We no longer saw any natural sunlight. It was behind this sheen. And in the US, it's been linked, in Texas again, it's been linked to this very nasty disease called Morgellons disease, which I encourage you to go take a look at for yourself. Now, Anthony Steen, the sitting MP in Totnes, was alerted to the chemtrails going over Totnes by a friend of mine, Christopher Cooper, actually one of the founders of the Steiner School in Totnes. And he went to Anthony Steen with the photographs, and he showed Anthony Steen. Anthony Steen, on his own initiative, went to the local paper and said, yes, one of my constituents has raised these issues, and yes, this is obviously a problem, and I'm going to ask the Ministry of Defence questions. You can Google that article for yourself. It was Anthony Steen in the Herald Express speaking about chemtrails. Well, he still hasn't come back formally to Christopher. But when Christopher went to his surgery and said, Anthony, you told me you were going to investigate this chemtrails thing. And he said, well, we're not in power, are we, right now? We're in opposition, and if we were in power, we might be able to find out a little bit more. And Christopher said, so you've been fobbed off then? Well, Michael Meacher gave a talk at Dartington Hall on the Dartington Trust a few weeks ago. And in a quiet chat afterwards to a small group, he said, you people, you've got to realize the power that those behind the scenes hold. Michael Meacher is a broken man, let me tell you. I think it was last year I said that one of the intents of the war in Iraq was to go out and seek and destroy the Sumerian artifacts because they were concerned that they might actually, if it became too well known, present an alternative view of the origins of mankind. And what I introduced you to last year was the fact, and it is a fact, let me tell you that, it's a fact, that those who are at the upper end of what David Rothkopf calls the superclass, they absolutely believe that they are the descendants of the Nephilim, i.e., those who from heaven to earth came, but those who were the fallen ones, those who were deposited here on Mount Hermon some 5,500 years ago, because they had interbred with human women. And these guys absolutely believe, they fundamentally believe, it is their occult belief system. This is the separated capstone from the pyramid, the knowledge held by the few for the control of the masses. And they believe that this is their global fiefdom. But they also know that their forefathers were doing a lot of experiments with genetic engineering, with transgenics, which is why, actually, there were previous incarnations of mankind that were wiped out. We know we're coming to the end of the fifth age. We are very much as in the days of Noah. But there's another reason, I believe, that they invaded Iraq and they have sent special forces out to scour the country looking for the Sumerian artifacts, and that is because they're looking for information that may be contained in those artifacts on genetic engineering and transgenics. Transgenics, the mixing of between races of the DNA. There's the evidence of this. Here in the UK, we're taking the lead by introducing legislation that gives those who have the desire within the scientific community to create human-animal hybrids. The first time that, as far as we know, we have had the technology to be able to do this since the days of Noah. Since the Anunnaki and the Nephilim were messing around with genetic engineering. Britain is right at the forefront of this. You know, this is the eugenics that was started in 1916 in the US. But then there was more opportunity, more willingness to take the science further in Germany. So the funding went over to Germany. And then with the advent of the Second World War, the funding came back to the US. Then with the end of the Second World War, the scientists that had been working on eugenics and transgenics came back into the US. They are trying to create the Superman. They are talking, I mean, these documents, back 40 years ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski was talking about, transgenics, creating the post-human, implanting chips. There's actually a piece of video that you can see on YouTube where one of the transgenic scientists is saying that he foresees a time in the very near future when mothers at the point of birth will have the option of introducing a chip in the brain of their babies. And this guy's mentality is such that he says, well, why wouldn't they? Because it will dramatically increase the ability of that child to process information. They will, in effect, be a superhuman. Actually, they will be inhuman. And this is where we're at right now. And this is the point that I've been making really for the last 2 occasions that I've spoken at the Glastonbury Symposium. We are not dealing here with humanity. We are dealing with a group of people, probably no more than 5,000 or 6,000 at the very top end, who are not human. They are inhuman. Everything about their behavior is inhuman. What defines humanity is love, compassion, cooperation. I mean, one of the things that I certainly learned working in the oil industry for 20 years is that mankind is fundamentally mutually supportive, cooperative. When the chips are down, everybody knuckles down together, like we did in Kuwait. In the advent of the first Gulf War, the fires of which, as I've said before, and I have an increasing amount of evidence to support, were started by the US Special Forces to create the opportunity, obviously, for America to fleece the Emir of Kuwait for $7 billion, which they did. I mean, it's just remarkable how much pressure must have been put on MPs to pass this legislation. There is nothing humane about this legislation, and it seriously does open Pandora's box, but that's exactly what they want. So where we're at, ladies and gentlemen, right now, is at a point where we cannot afford, in my opinion, to bury our heads in the sand. Mankind is under attack. Humanity is under attack by a group of people who are not human. They believe humans were created as a slave race and are today no more, no better than slaves, to be manipulated at their whim. So, this is bio-spiritual warfare or psycho-spiritual warfare. It's pernicious. It's not one-dimensional. That's why I join all these dots together, and other people through the weekend will speak on specifics of this, because we have to be cognizant of it. Because if we're not, and our generation, by the way, isn't really going to be affected. We are not the target here. It is the children. And go Google the murals at Denver Airport, the New World Airport. Go take a look at those murals, because those murals tell a very interesting story.